Time now for Focus, and today we have a report on elections for the head of the Tibetan government in exile and members of parliament. Tens of thousands of people taking part, many of them in the Indian city of Dharamsala, the capital of Tibetans in exile. The government's aim being autonomy, not independence. From India, France 24's Constantin Simon and Shreya Banerjee report.
Voting day. And a prayer, that of an entire people.
May the two candidates be blessed and peace and freedom for Tibet.
Some of these voters were born in Tibet, others here in Dharamsala in northern India. They're electing their Sikyong, the head of the Tibetan government in exile, and members of parliament. Close to 140,000 members of the Tibetan diaspora live across the world. Palden Gyasto is 85 years old. He was a political prisoner for 33 years under the Chinese.
These elections are very important. Before, Tibet was independent and we had our own leaders. We may have lost the land, but we've succeeded in creating a democratic system here comparable to those of the big Western democracies.
This was the strategy of the Dalai Lama, to establish a government in exile, a democracy. This to counter claims by the Chinese that it was in fact a theocratic regime. International observers were also present among the voters.
The voting booths here are different than ours in France. They're not completely closed. The Indian police are also here, and they ensure security during the elections. They make sure there are no incidents or that people don't try to influence voters.
The favorite in this election is incumbent Prime Minister Lobsang Sangay. Like the Dalai Lama, he no longer asks for an independent Tibet, but instead wants greater autonomy within China.
Dialogue is a two-way process. We are willing, anytime, anywhere, and it's for the Chinese government to initiate, give us a signal, and we will have the dialogue between the envoys of the Dalai Lama and representative of the Chinese government.
For 6 years now, negotiations have come to a standstill. Many Tibetans would like this dialogue to restart as soon as possible, especially the youth. Serin lives in Australia.
We try to live with China for 200 years. More than that, we pay them tax. We try to live with them peaceful way, and still they cannot accept, and we have to escape. And we have no opportunity. Same school, we don't have any opportunity that what Chinese citizens have. For example, very simple. In China, they do 1 million passports every day, but Tibetan people, you cannot have a passport.
Since the Dalai Lama fled to India in 1959 after a failed uprising, Dharamsala has become the capital of Tibetans in exile. Nicknamed Little Lhasa, the Tibetan flag flies here in this small village nestled in the Himalayas, while in Lhasa it's forbidden. Here, the Tibetans in exile have their own institutions, like this parliament with its 45 members. This morning, the session begins with a minute's silence for 2 Tibetans who set themselves on fire earlier this month to protest Chinese rule in Tibet. In the past 20 years, these immolations have multiplied, resulting in the deaths of 117 Tibetans. Till 2011, the Dalai Lama presided over this assembly, which manages the lives of exiled Tibetans.
Mostly we will discuss on the budget 2016 for the education, for the health, the donations from different countries, and also all Tibetans we also contribute as our tax.
A quarter of the government's budget is set aside for education. 24,000 Tibetans are educated in India. Some have crossed the Himalayas without their parents. Like Pempa, who's 15 and who lives in a boarding school 10 kilometers from Dharamsala.
My parents think that if I go to India, it's better, so I can learn better.
A better education also means the opportunity to study in his mother tongue. Pempa also learns Hindi and English.
We have to learn Tibetan cultures and Tibetan education. We can fight with pens and book, not with weapons. So we can take Tibet back from China.
The Dalai Lama is currently recovering after an operation. This summer, the spiritual leader of the Tibetans will celebrate his 80th birthday. He has indicated that he might be the last Dalai Lama, perhaps to prevent the Chinese from naming his successor.
And for more on the elections in Tibet, I'm joined now by Tibet expert Katja Buffetri. Hello, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, what were the main issues during the campaign for these elections?
Well, the main issue this time was that they had several candidates, and one was pro-independence. This was the first time that there was a pro-independence candidate. Since the first election, it was 5 years ago when the Dalai Lama retired from all political duties, and at that time it was only middle-way candidates.
Why is it that the Dalai Lama gave up, so to speak, on independence and decided instead to push for autonomy?
In 1988, he decided to give up the independence and because he thought that it was maybe a possibility to go on to resume the discussion with the Chinese. And he asked for an autonomy, but at that time he asked for autonomy, not only in what is called the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but also the area, Kham and Amdo, which are populated by Tibetan, but are not in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And since he has that, it was for some Tibetan, it was really a big problem because they had the impression to be betrayed. But the Dalai Lama has his speech, his word is very important. So now you have two parties. You have it become a kind of conflict, and it's difficult for the pro-independence people to speak because they are quickly accused to be against the Dalai Lama and sometimes to betray the nation.
And how are these elections being viewed by China?
Well, the Chinese, they ask, as usual, to the foreign country not to help in any way what they call separatist process. And of course, they don't recognize the exile government in Dharamsala. And they say that if they speak one day again with people from exile, it will be with the envoys of the Dalai Lama, not with the elected Prime Minister.
Now, voting, as I understand, wrapped up more than a week ago, but we're not expecting the results until April, and yet it was just a few thousand people, tens of thousands of people who took part. Is there any explanation for why there's such a delay?
No, it's much more. You had 90,000 people who were able to vote, and until now you have you have Tibetan everywhere in the world. So they have to
So it's because you're gathering votes from all over the place.
And now they have something like 58,000, and Lobsang Sangay has 35, and the other one 24. So it's about 10,000 difference between the both candidates.
Now, as we heard in the report we played just before this interview, scores of Tibetan protesters have set themselves alight in the last 20 years, frustrated with the lack of what they see as a lack of progress towards greater freedoms. Why is it that they resort to that particular form of protest? Why is that? Have we seen that happen time and time again?
Well, it's not something which was well known before in Tibet. One of the reasons they give, they present the ones who left a testament. They present that as like a lamp which will enlight the ignorance and bring peace. They see that more as a constructive act than something which is destructive. But the problem is they don't want to destroy anyone else. They don't want to wound somebody else. So they decided to take that. But it just started in exile in 1998, and the first in Tibet was in 2009. And right now we have about, we don't know exactly, but it's seen that it's 142 in Tibet and 8 in exile. The last one in exile being 16 years old.
And as we await the results of these elections, how would you describe the state of individual freedoms in Tibet and the overall situation?
Well, in Tibet, you don't have individual freedom. And the situation is very difficult now, like it is in China also, because Xi Jinping is quite a hard man. And the situation in Tibet, in Xinjiang, with the Uyghur or the Mongol, everywhere it's very difficult. And in the Tibetan case, the situation, it's right now, because it's closed in Tibet Autonomous Region, because of the March is a very sensible month, since there is the uprising of Lhasa in 1959, the Tibetan Autonomous Region is closed to foreigners, but it's close also to the Tibetan from Amdo and come from the eastern region, which sounds very, very strange because it's their country.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us for today's focus, Katia Buffetry, and thank you for watching. Time for a break. I'll be back in a few minutes with all of the news for you. Stay tuned.